Greetings, and welcome to the Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. We hope that you enjoy what you're about to see, and you can find us on the corner of Broadway and Church Streets at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Or you can find us at bgmethodist.org and on Facebook at Bowling Green First United Methodist Church. That last verse there is kind of a doozy. It's kind of like what's going on here. This whole chapter that John chapter 9 is, it's got this whole crazy thing that is going on inside of it that is coming down to. You've got at the first part of it, Jesus heals a man who was blind, who they found who was begging on the side of the road, and the disciples asked a question. There was a common belief at their time. They said, well, Jesus, who sinned that this man is blind? Because the thought was, well, if you are blind, if you are in some way deformed like that, because they saw that as a deformity, then obviously someone had to do something to make that happen. Therefore, his parents must have been sinners, and there's probably been a good chance that he also is a sinner. And so the disciples asked, well, Jesus, who did this? And Jesus... I can almost imagine Jesus giving almost a good impression of our statue up there, just going, oh, my children, you all are asking the wrong thing. There was no one that sinned that caused this to happen, but here, let me show you how God is going to work in all of this. Now, that's because Jesus began, this chapter is, Jesus, the man who was blind, his parents, so many are confronting this belief that was going at the time that said, if there is something wrong with you, that, something physically wrong with you, in this case, if you were born blind, then that obviously is the result of what your parents did. And your parents were sinners, and you're probably a sinner, and you got to deal with it. And so we have, this verse then, where the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time had been following this blind man around. They get to him and they say to him, give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner, because they don't like Jesus. They're telling the man, give glory to God, because Jesus is a sinner. And so you better do this, because otherwise you're going to be in trouble, because we know everything. Now the trouble with all of this is that the argument that they've set up here, that there was a belief at that time, is one of these crazy sorts of arguments that gets cause and effect mixed up. That says if things seem like they kind of move together, and that there might be related somehow, that one of them obviously caused the other one. I ran across several years ago this great example of. And it's a few years old now, but great example of someone setting up a similar type of argument. He looked at it and he noticed, he said, well, we know that the average world temperature has been going up pretty consistently over the last 200 years. And he said, we've also noticed that over that same period of time, over the last couple of hundred years, that the average number of pirates in the world has been going down. And so he draws the obvious conclusion and says, if you want to combat global warming, become a pirate. Because these things are related. It doesn't work that way. This is an absurd sort of, but this is the kind of argument that the Pharisees and others had been making. They said, well, if you had this problem, then someone was a sinner. If you really want to combat global warming, then you need to become a pirate. These things don't make sense. They're ridiculous. They're absurd. This is why at the start of the story, I can see Jesus doing this thing. Because he's taking on this absurd belief that they had that was actually causing far more harm than it ever caused any good. And John spends all of chapter 9 kind of going through all of this, because Jesus starts it off. He's the first one to do it, but he's not the last. To point out how ridiculous this is. Because the other thing that Jesus did, Jesus had the gall to perform this miracle where he healed the man on a Sabbath. You weren't supposed to work on a Sabbath, and obviously performing a miracle is working, and so they were really upset with him. They were upset with Jesus. Really, they were looking to find a way to try and bring him in, to bring him up on charges, to bring him into their form of justice. And Jesus is calling them out on the absurdity of what it is that they're doing. Now this goes on and somewhere, there we go. Jesus makes some mud, puts it on the man's eyes, and tells him, he says, go and wash this off at the pool of Siloam. And the man goes off. The man hasn't seen Jesus, he's just heard his voice. So he goes, he does that, and he can see when he comes up out of the water, but he still can pick Jesus out of a lineup unless, of course, he heard his voice, because he'd never seen him. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of that time, some of the religious leaders of that time, heard about this story. They were getting upset. And they began to go to try and find this man who used to be blind, so that they could ask him some questions. Now, I read this story, you know what, and I brought back to my childhood, watching the Dukes of Hazzard on TV. And you get Boss Hogg chasing the Duke boys all around Hazzard County. This is what's going on now. They begin chasing this man all around this town to try and find him so that they can ask him these questions. They're running around. They finally catch up to him. They finally get to him, and they corner him, and they're talking to him, and they ask him, "Who did this to you? How did he do it?" Because they are irate at this point, and they are ready to come after him. And the man responds to him. He's had it up to about here at this point with him. And he's got nothing else to lose. Because he was a blind man before this. He was begging on the side of the road. He didn't have a place in their society. He literally had nothing to lose. By the time he responds to him, he says to him, I already told you, and you didn't want to listen. Why do you want to hear it again? And then my favorite part of this, do you want to become his disciples too? This is the part where you can read about this much sarcasm into his response, because they know good and well they don't want to become one of Jesus' disciples. But this is this way of saying, y'all are the most ridiculous people I think I've ever seen. I know what you're trying to do here. Everybody around here knows what you're trying to do here, and I'm going to be one of them that's going to stop and say, I'm not going to put up with it anymore. I'm not going to deal with it. Jesus starts this story off by basically doing exactly that. The man does that here exactly also. He's putting that line in the sand and saying, no more. We're done with this. I'm not going to deal with this. And we're going to see what's going to happen to him a little bit later. But he is one that draws that line in the sand. Now, sometimes folks aren't able to do that, no matter how much they might like to do it. Because remember, the Pharisees had scared everybody. It even said that in our reading for this morning. They had made everyone afraid. Because these are folks that had built their power and their authority at the expense of others. And because they had done that, folks were afraid of them. They were afraid that they would be kicked out of their community that they needed to be a part of so that they could survive from day to day to day. And they could work to meet their needs and help others. They needed to be a part of that, and they were scared. They were afraid. But we begin to see the power of Jesus' teachings, even in some very small ways. We see as they're making that run around, it's not Hazzard County, I guess you could say Galilee. They stop at one point at the man's parents, and they say to him, where's your son? Was he really blind? Was he really born blind? Is he really your son? They start asking him all these questions, and they're responding to him, and you can see then at one point they say this to him. They say, he's old enough, ask him. Now I have to admit, sometimes when I read this, I read that, and I read what they're saying there, and I say, boy, that's the coward's way out. Grow a spine, and actually, and say something really about what's going on. It's I read it that way, but other times I look at that and I read it, and I go, that's really kind of brilliant. Because they knew they couldn't do much of anything. They were just trying to hold on to their place in society. But they weren't also going to let the Pharisees walk all over them. And so they did what they could. It's a small thing, but what they didn't do was bend over backwards to answer all the Pharisees' questions. By golly, they were not going to do that. Instead, rather than do that, they say, go ask him. Now, I'm pretty sure they probably knew what their son's feelings were on the whole situation. That they were pretty sure of what their son's response was going to be. They took one small action. They said, go ask him. They directed the Pharisees off to go find the one person that was going to tell them to go take a hike. It's not big, it's not flashy, it's not making a big line in the sand, but it was doing something that was not expected and directing them to someone who was going to tell them what he thought. We see as the story goes that what the man said and did caught up something. It's not the end of the story because the man and Jesus get back together at one point down along the way. But they finally, the Pharisees have finally had enough with this man who had been blind, and they said to him, "You were born completely in sin." Remember, this is the absurd argument this whole chapter is based on that says, well, you are blind, therefore you are wrong, therefore you are deformed, therefore your parents must have sinned before this, and so, you must obviously be a horrible, wretched human being. You were born completely in sin. How dare you teach us? This is one of the things that happens with folks like these Pharisees in there, is that because they had built everything they had at the expense of others, they viewed others as inferior to them, therefore they couldn't learn anything from them. And so how dare this guy who was nothing confront them and try to teach them anything? And then they go on and they expel them from the community. Which really at that point was like him moving about 1 foot to the left, because he was already there on the edge of that community anyway, because he was a blind beggar. That really didn't have that much an effect on him, but they thought it was an awful big deal. But it really wasn't. And it was all, again, it was just the absurdity of this whole situation they found themselves in. The challenge is, what do we do in the midst of this? Because this is not something that ended back with them. This was not something that ended in their time. There are all sorts of folks, whether they are religious authorities or other leaders or in other places, in other situations, in other contexts, big or small. We find folks that do that. They have built who they are at the expense of other people. And so how do we see in this whole chapter, how is it that Jesus responds? How does he call us to respond in the middle of it? We get to, there we go. And there are three things we can look at in this. The first one, just simply to call it out. Just point out, and if you have to, give one of these things. Even do the whole physical thing and just kind of exaggerate that you think this is ridiculous and absurd, that they're even raising this point. No one cares about how many pirates there are versus, how much the average global temperature is going up. That's an absurd, ridiculous thing to have. It makes no sense. Similarly, when someone says, well, that's obviously the parents' fault that this all, or it's obviously the kids' fault, hold on, I said that right the first time. The parents are obviously sinners, therefore their kid is, they've got all these problems. Sometimes we just got to call it out and say, this isn't how this works. And sometimes it is that stand up to it. Because this is what we see that the Pharisees are doing, and they're engaging here. They're engaging as bullies. They are doing this as bullies. This is what they have done. The way that they are treating others. And sometimes this is, we are called to stand up to them. But where we have to know is, what is it that we are called to do? Some folks, like the blind man, like Jesus did, and like, as we're going to see later, the disciples and who would become the apostles will do, they kind of draw that line in the sand, and they make a big stand of it. They make a big show of it. They really make an important point of it. That's what they're called. That's what they have the ability to do. But some folks are just like his parents were. They couldn't afford to make that big stand, but they had one seemingly small thing that they could do. And it really pushes the story forward. It's one little piece, but it makes a big difference. Sometimes that's all it takes, is to do that small thing. This is probably the hardest part of this. But the last part of it is this thing that we see Jesus do all the time. That is the thing that really starts this story off, is Jesus reaches out to the folks that, last week I called them the L's, the least, last, lost, lonely, and left out. These are the folks that you can recognize because they have run out of money, they've run out of resources, they've run out of support long before they run out of problems. And the problems just seem to be big and insurmountable. They just can't ever get past them. What we see Jesus do is he reaches out and he helps. He provides help where he can, because he knows that if you can help those folks begin to kind of stand up a little bit and stand up on their own 2 feet, or even just make some progress in that regard, that changes things. That gives, in this case, the Pharisees, or in our case, anyone else who would engage in those same things, it gives them less power over other people. It makes those arguments they make even more silly and ridiculous and absurd, even if we do something to help them stand up on their own. Now, that's going to be a challenge, and that's kind of a long-term project to do, and it's going to be full of lots of frustration, because folks that are in that place, the least, last, lost, lonely, and left out, they don't ever have a lot of hope. And when you don't have hope, that often means that you don't do the things that everyone expects you to do. But that's because you've never been in that place where you can have any more expectations than maybe just what the next hour or the next day will bring. But this is what we see Jesus do so well. And we see him do that and reach out and help folks in their time of need, just to provide them what it is they need to be able to stand up on their own. And when that happens, we begin to see how that changes and how that snowballs. At first, all of this was just Jesus and a small group of disciples standing up to the religious authorities in a small little backwater province of Israel in the Roman Empire. But in time, this same place that Jesus starts, these same teachings that he starts with, they begin to do something new. They begin to chip away at the fabric of Roman society, to tear off pieces of that and reform it and change it. And it scares even the mighty Roman Empire because of what they're doing, because of what it is that Jesus is teaching. He never built any of his power at the expense of others. Jesus built his authority by calling out ridiculous things, by standing up to the people that would take things from others, and by helping the folks that couldn't help themselves. This is the work that we see him do. Now, we aren't going to be able to do it on Jesus' level, but there is part of that we can do ourselves. That we can reach out and we can do these things. And most importantly, we can do this last part. Whether it's through things like Festival of Sharing, or helping at the Hope Center, or any number of other opportunities we have around town, this is the kind of work that we can do that has the power to change the world around us. Let us go and see where we can be at work and the things that we can do. And let us go and do all of those things in Christ's name.